Hey, it's Kevin, and I'm here today to give a very brief critique of conservatism in America. For all intents and purposes, conservatism in America is dead, and I'll explain why in just a minute. But before I do that, I want to give a quick operational definition of what it means to be a conservative. If you take a look at the word, the root is conserve. And when you conserve something, you hold on to it. So if you're a conservative person by nature, you're going to hold on to the status quo. You're going to go through your life, and if you have to make a change, you're going to do it at a very gradual clip, a very slow pace. So for all intents and purposes, if you're a conservative, you like the way things are and you don't see much of a reason to change it. Now, conservatism can take many forms. It can take the form of fiscal conservatism. In other words, to be a fiscal conservative means you're very, very cautious with spending. You don't spend more than you're bringing in. And this can mean you personally. It can mean a government official who is over a jurisdiction. That person will not spend more than the jurisdiction takes in. That's fiscal conservatism. You could be a social conservative. You can believe, if you're a social conservative, that our traditional mores and values are good things and something that needs to be held onto. So in our culture here in America, the traditional Judeo-Christian values would be something that you would like to maintain if you're a social conservative. And the relationship of the government to the people, the constitutional constraints, would be something that you would also want to maintain. Another example is being a religious conservative. If you're a religious conservative, the tenets of your doctrine or faith or denomination you see as being very, very valuable to keep just the way they are. Or if you have to change them only very minimally. So there are many facets to being a conservative, and you can be a conservative in several different ways. But the general idea of what it means to be a conservative is that you like the status quo, you don't like to see big changes, and if you do have to have changes, you want those changes to come very, very gradually. And so what's fascinating is that at the national level, at the upper echelons of our political spheres, true conservatism is actually dead. Take a look at the Republican Party. Take a look at its most recent products, at its most recent president before Trump, George W. Bush. President Bush ran on a platform of compassionate conservatism, of fiscal responsibility, not nation building, and being very pro-constitutional. The results of George W. Bush's presidency were an extra $6 trillion added to the debt, an illegal and undeclared war in Iraq, which was a complete quagmire, a Patriot Act which eviscerated the Constitution, especially the Fourth Amendment, and a forever alteration in the relationship between the government and the people. His administration was not conservative at all. The only thing I could say for Mr. Bush and him being a true conservative was his purported religious values. His speeches on those were the same from start to finish, so he does get credit for that. Everything else, though, was totally unconservative, extremely non-conservative. If you take a look at some of the other leaders of the Republican Party, you see similar weaknesses in their ideology. People go on about John McCain. He is a war hawk. He is probably one of the most frightening people in D.C. because he is so unstable and so thirsty for war. Remember, a true conservative does not like rapid change. Nothing changes societies more rapidly than war. If you take a look at the United States before World War II and after World War II, look at how great the changes were. Look at how big of a difference those two periods really are. So war changes societies quicker, more than anything else. Therefore, a true conservative doesn't like war. It's not something they would rush into eagerly. Unfortunately, in DC, especially with the Republican Party, we have, for the most part, a bunch of war hawks who head the party. The answer for everything, seemingly, is let's go to war. McCain, again, singing Bomb Bomb Iran to the Beach Boys song, Barbara Ann. He typifies the neoconservatives that have taken over the Republican Party. So the folks at the head of the Republican Party are not going to fit the bill that the classic conservative would fit. There are a few that are sprinkled in. I think you could probably make the argument that Rand Paul may fit the bill as far as being a paleo-conservative or a classical conservative. But by and large, the Republican Party is led by neoconservatives, war hawks who really don't care about the fiscal policy of the country. What's interesting, though, there is hope for the classical conservatives out there. If you fancy yourself a paleo-conservative or a classical conservative, your hope is going to come about 10 to 15 years in the future. The generation that is arising next, Generation Z, these are the folks who are born about the year 2000 and beyond. Studies are showing that this is the most conservative, truly conservative generation since the World War II greatest generation. So these young people are more conservative than any generation since that traditional generation that fought in World War II. If that holds, and I think it will, you're going to see a swing back to classic conservatism probably in about 10 to 15 years. One more thing. My personal experiences with conservatism. I would not grade myself a conservative by any stretch. I think my own policies are still forming. My own ideology is still hardening right now. I'll say this, I'm a fan of Donald Trump. I'm a fan of President Trump for several reasons. One of which, he is actively destroying both the Democratic and Republican parties as we speak. And that's something that has been long overdue. Neither one of those parties have truly benefited the people in at least 20 to 30 years. But what's funny is showing any support for Trump's policies, let's say his policy on health care, brought about the most ire, not from progressives, not from liberals, but from people who claim to be these hardline, old school conservatives. It's amazing. I made a post in support of President Trump's reorganization of the healthcare system. And I was chastised for doing so because to be in support of that was to not be conservative, to be unconservative. And I found that to be a very amazing stance to take because it almost ignores the actions of the president, the Republican president before George W. Bush. And so when I confronted this individual on this discrepancy of why he would not comment on the rampant unconservative behavior of Bush too, he refused to talk about it. And so it's a common theme amongst these kind of old school conservatives that are anti-Trump and who pine for these days of George W. Bush. Number one, they're extreme hypocrites in their approach. But number two, they pine for this imaginary America where there's only a handful of roles for the federal government. And aside from that, the federal government just doesn't need to exist. And so it's this wooden navy mentality that comes out, this group that really longs for the days of the wooden navy and the log roads and the days where the president or the federal government would only coin money, provide for the national defense, and work at patents. And that was it. And to me, it's such an unrealistic worldview. Number one, to totally turn a blind eye to the neoconservatives currently in power, who are destroying much of the nation. And number two, to pine and fancy for this imaginary America that never really existed, this wooden navy ideal. Totally insane, totally crazy, but that's my observations. I love Trump for many reasons. I think he's doing a great job so far. And one of the reasons is he is actively destroying both the Democratic and Republican parties. And that is a great thing, because neither of these parties have served the American people for at least 20 to 30 years. They need to be destroyed. We need to build up something that is more representative of our people. So that's it. That's all I have. Conservatism right now is dead. For you true conservatives, though, you're going to see a resurrection in about 15 years, I'd say. Watch out for Gen Z. They're coming up right now. They're the most conservative thing since your grandparents or your great-grandparents. I hope you enjoyed that. I hope you're having a good time wherever, whenever you're at. God bless you. Take care.